It began with excitement, as so many misfortunes do. The year was 1870, and a small group of explorers, including Truman Everts, set out to survey the wild and largely unknown Yellowstone region. The area was rumored to be filled with boiling springs, steaming geysers, and untamed beauty. It was a land not yet captured by maps, a mystery even to the most seasoned frontiersmen. Everts, a 54-year-old former tax assessor with no real experience in backcountry survival, had joined the expedition not for glory or riches, but out of curiosity and a desire for adventure. He was small, wiry, and determined, a man who believed his intelligence would make up for any physical shortcomings. That belief would soon be tested in ways he could never have imagined. The group traveled on horseback, each member responsible for their own supplies and pack animal. Everts had chosen a temperamental horse and a skittish pack mule, perhaps not the wisest decision, but one he would have to live with. For days, they navigated through dense forests, crossed icy rivers, and camped beneath open skies. The beauty of Yellowstone was breathtaking, but danger lurked in every shadow. On September 9th, everything changed. The group had split up temporarily to scout the terrain, a common practice that day. Everts, ever curious and a bit too confident, wandered off the agreed path to investigate a peculiar geothermal feature. By the time he realized how far he'd strayed, the forest had closed in behind him like a curtain. He was alone. He called out, fired his pistol into the air, and even climbed a hill to scan the horizon, but no response came. The wilderness swallowed his voice. As night approached, panic crept in like a cold wind. He had no tent, no real food beyond a bit of bread and meat, and only minimal gear. His horse had bolted. His pack mule was nowhere to be seen. Darkness in Yellowstone is not like the night in a town or city. It is deep, absolute. The sounds of wildlife, unseen and unknowable, echoed through the trees. Everts huddled beneath a pine tree, wrapping himself in his thin coat, shivering more from fear than cold. He tried to sleep, but the howls of distant wolves and the rustling of unseen creatures kept his eyes wide open. By morning, the reality had set in. He was lost. But Truman Everts was not ready to die. He began to walk. With no compass and only a vague sense of direction, he chose a path downhill, hoping it would lead to water or perhaps back to the river they had crossed earlier. He moved carefully, conserving energy, marking trees with broken twigs and small piles of stone, makeshift breadcrumbs in case he needed to backtrack. That first full day alone in Yellowstone tested him physically, but it was the mental strain that weighed heavier. Thoughts spiraled. Would they come back for him? Was anyone looking? What if they thought he'd simply gone home? When he found a stream, he drank deeply and soaked his aching feet. The cold water was a balm, but the hunger gnawed at him already. With no way to hunt, no knowledge of foraging, he had to rely on what little he had, and that wouldn't last more than a day or two. Night fell again, and this time he built a small fire, using the last of his matches and dried moss he'd scavenged. The fire gave him courage, a flickering symbol of hope in the vast dark. He whispered to himself, "I will survive this." It was the beginning of the longest 37 days of his life. The fire from that second night crackled low like a faint heartbeat in the vast wilderness. Truman Everts fed it carefully with twigs and dry pine needles, fearing it might vanish, just like everything else he had depended on. It offered no warmth to his feet, which were already blistered and swelling, but it gave him something else. Focus. In the chaos of his mind, it was a singular task that reminded him, you are still alive. When dawn returned, the forest took on a different mood. Morning mist floated between the trees, and the early light turned dew into diamonds. Everts sat up slowly, each movement resisted by sore muscles and bruises. He had survived another night, but he knew the coming days would demand more than hope and willpower. His stomach was already screaming. The last of his bread had gone stale and molded from moisture. The bit of dried meat had been rationed to a final bite the evening before. Now, hunger was no longer an annoyance, it was an enemy. He remembered stories of edible roots and plants, lessons read long ago but never practiced. Moving cautiously, he explored the area near the stream. He found something that resembled a thistle and pulled it up by the roots. It tasted bitter, but it stayed down. Whether it would keep him alive or make him sick remained to be seen. He chewed slowly, counting each bite like a prayer. Determined to conserve his energy, Everts didn't travel far that day. Instead, he followed the stream, staying close to water and observing the land. He knew the others might be searching, but Yellowstone was vast and he had no way to signal. He had one more match left. One! As the sun rose higher, the temperature warmed, but it brought new dangers. Mosquitoes swarmed, biting relentlessly. He swatted at them until his arms were red and raw. Worse were the sudden bubbling pools of hot mud and geysers that hissed with steam. He nearly stumbled into one hidden by the underbrush, just inches from disaster. Yellowstone, it seemed, could kill in silence or sound. That night, he didn't risk using the last match. Instead, he gathered dry moss, bark, and pine cones, trying to start a fire with stones. Hours passed. Sparks flew but died out. When darkness swallowed the forest again, he sat alone in the cold. No fire, no warmth. Just the ache of hunger and the long, terrifying howl of a wolf far too close. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by the chill and the sounds of snapping twigs. His dreams were hallucinations. Meals shared with friends, laughter in warm rooms, the scent of coffee. Each time he woke, the brutal reality crashed back down. In the morning, his hands were shaking. He needed food, real food. He followed the stream further and spotted a bird perched on a low branch. Slowly, silently, he approached. He lifted a stone and threw it. He missed. But the act itself sparked something in him. A new kind of determination, not desperation, strategy. He gathered stones of various sizes, selected a few with sharp edges, and fashioned what resembled crude tools. With strips of his shirt, he bound one to a branch. A spear? Maybe. Or just wishful thinking. Then, a breakthrough. He stumbled upon a cluster of berries, bright red, growing in the shade. He hesitated. They looked like gooseberries, but they could also be poisonous. He took one, crushed it, and rubbed the juice on his wrist. He waited. No rash. Then on his lip. Still nothing. Finally, he swallowed a single berry. Hours passed. He didn't get sick. With shaking hands, he gathered as many as he could carry in the fold of his shirt. That night, he feasted. Not on meat, but on something. And for the first time since he'd gotten lost, his belly didn't scream. The sky above sparkled with stars. He still had no fire, but the cold didn't bite as deep. He curled beneath a pine and stared upward, whispering names of the men from the expedition. Maybe one of them was looking for him now. Maybe they'd be here tomorrow. Or maybe not. But now, he had a reason to keep going. A victory, however small. The berries weren't much, but they proved something essential. He could adapt. Everts awoke to a soft drizzle pattering on the pine needles above. His shirt was damp, his limbs stiff, and his lips cracked. But he was alive, and he had berries in his stomach. That, he told himself, was enough for today. He continued to follow the stream, now his only compass. It carved its way through the forest like a silver thread, occasionally breaking into small rapids and hidden pools. Each bend felt like a decision, each fork a gamble. But it was better than wandering aimlessly. As he trudged forward, he noticed more signs of geothermal activity, sulfuric steam rising from fissures in the earth, hot springs bordered by unnatural colors. Some were beautiful, others smelled like rotten eggs. All were dangerous. He kept his distance. That afternoon the weather turned. The gentle drizzle became a cold, relentless rain. The forest canopy provided little shelter, and soon Everts was soaked through. His thin clothes clung to him like wet paper. He tried to build a lean-to from branches and bark, but his hands were trembling too much to work properly. The cold seeped in like a poison. By evening, his lips were blue and his teeth wouldn't stop chattering. He gathered wood, anything that seemed remotely dry, and pulled out his last match. His fingers fumbled. He struck it once. Nothing. Twice. Still nothing. The third time, the head flared, a fragile miracle. But the wood was too wet. The flame died with a hiss, and with it the last of his controlled fire. He stared at the burnt matchstick in disbelief. No more fire, no more warmth. The sky above was iron gray, and the night promised no kindness. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. The cold made his joints scream, and the rain soaked his very bones. He tucked himself under a thicket, curled tight, and prayed. Not to be rescued. He'd given up hope on that for the night, but simply to wake up. When morning came, the rain had stopped, but the world felt heavier. His limbs didn't want to move. His fingers were numb and swollen, and each breath rattled in his chest. He knew he had to keep walking, but the thought of standing sent a wave of nausea over him. Still he rose, slowly, painfully. He chewed on a few remaining berries and forced his body forward. The forest was silent, not peaceful, eerie, as though even the animals had taken shelter from the cruel wet night. Around midday he spotted smoke, a thin column rising between the trees. His heart raced. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people, rescue, warmth, food. He ran. Branches tore at his skin, and his legs screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. He crashed through brush, stumbled over roots, and sprinted toward that single promise of life. As he got closer, he shouted, "Hello!" No answer, just the soft whisper of wind. He burst into a clearing and stopped. The smoke wasn't from a campfire, it was from a thermal vent. The earth had split here, and steam hissed out in plumes. The warmth he felt was real, but deadly. No people, no help. Just the cruel trick of nature playing with his last thread of hope. He dropped to his knees. He didn't cry. He didn't have the water left in his body to waste on tears. Instead, he sat near the vent, cautiously allowing its heat to touch his chilled skin. He stayed long enough to dry his clothes, careful not to get too close. One wrong step and he'd be boiled alive. Once warm again, the ache of hunger returned with renewed force. He forced himself to move, to gather more berries, but the patch was thinning. He needed a new food source. He began scanning trees for signs of squirrels or birds. He was walking the razor's edge, between cleverness and madness. He spoke aloud now just to hear a voice, even if it was his own. That night, without fire, he used dried moss as a pillow and pine branches as a blanket. It wasn't enough, but it helped. As he drifted in and out of sleep, he thought about his children. Their faces were blurry in his mind, but their laughter rang clear. The memory became his warmth, not fire, not food, but memory. And somehow it was enough to last until morning. The next morning brought a weak sun peeking through the mist as if the heavens themselves were uncertain of him. Truman Everts rose slowly from the pine bed, his back aching and his muscles stiff. His fingers had regained some feeling, though they trembled slightly. He knew he could not afford to stay still. The only path was forward, always forward. The terrain began to shift. The gentle slope of the stream bed gave way to uneven ground, and dense forest thinned into rocky outcrops. Boulders littered the trail like obstacles in a cruel game. He had to climb now, sometimes on all fours, gripping damp stone and root. He slipped more than once. On one fall, he gashed his knee, the blood soaking into his pants. He tore a strip from his shirt and tied it tightly. The cloth was filthy, but it was all he had. Above, hawks circled. Below, the valley dipped into a ravine where steam rose once again. He wondered how much of Yellowstone was like this, a land at war with itself, boiling from the inside out. It felt like a place humans were never meant to linger. His stomach was a hollow drum. He found a few more berries, sparse, bitter, shriveled, and forced them down. Then, to his surprise, he stumbled upon something else. A patch of wild onions. The sharp scent was unmistakable. He chewed one raw, his mouth puckering, but it filled him with joy. Food. Real food. He dug up as many as he could carry, placing them in a makeshift pouch fashioned from what remained of his pocket lining. By midday, he reached the edge of a cliff. The view stretched for miles, miles of untouched forest, winding rivers, and distant peaks. It should have inspired awe, but to Everts, it only underscored his isolation. Somewhere out there, perhaps only a few days away, were his fellow explorers, or maybe they'd already returned east, assuming him dead. He sat on a flat rock, chewing another onion, and considered his next move. Climbing down the cliff was impossible, too steep, too loose. He'd have to go around, and so he did. The path along the cliff edge was narrow, and the drop below was lethal. He moved carefully, testing each step. At one point, the trail crumbled beneath his boot and he fell to one knee. Rocks tumbled into the abyss, echoing for long seconds before silence. He stayed there for several minutes, breath ragged, before crawling to safety. As dusk fell, he found a small overhang in the rock wall. It wasn't a cave, but it was dry, and that was enough. He used pine boughs as bedding and wrapped himself in his arms. The cold returned, but the wind was blocked, and his body still held a little heat from the sun. He thought of the expedition again, of their shared laughter around fires, the smell of coffee, the sound of spoons scraping tin. Would they come back for him, or would he be just a name mentioned in sorrow? He pushed the thought away. Instead, he focused on the next day, on the next step, on the need to keep moving. That night, as stars blinked overhead and the wind howled through the canyons like ghosts mourning the lost, Truman Everts lay awake. Still hungry, still weak, still alive. Everts woke to a low growl in the distance. It wasn't the wind nor the creak of trees. It was something alive. His heart slammed against his chest as he listened, holding his breath. The growl came again, more like a cough, followed by heavy footfalls crunching over fallen needles and stone. A bear. He didn't move, didn't even blink. The great beast was close, and Everts had no weapons, only his useless pistol, which he had long since used for signal shots and had no more powder. He lay as still as a stone beneath the rocky overhang, praying the bear would pass. A shadow passed the opening, massive, lumbering. The scent of musk and earth filled the air. Then, as suddenly as it came, the shadow disappeared. Silence returned. He waited a full hour before daring to move. When he finally crawled out from the overhang, his body was sore and his joints ached, but he was safe. The bear, he realized, had likely been using the area as part of its trail. That narrow space had saved him. But it was a reminder. Yellowstone was not just wilderness, it was a land claimed by beasts. He moved on, still hugging the cliffside. Eventually the trail widened and he found himself descending into a forested basin, a place more sheltered, almost tranquil. The sun filtered through the canopy in golden beams. There were more signs of life here. Squirrels, birds, and even a fox that darted away before he could react. The discovery that changed his day was a fallen tree, its trunk split wide with rot. Beneath it, he found insects, fat, wriggling grubs. The idea of eating them turned his stomach, but hunger was no longer polite. It was desperate. He crushed one and tasted it. Bitter, but not unbearable. He ate several. He also chewed on pine needles and the soft inner bark of saplings, both harsh but offering some vitamins. He remembered reading once that indigenous peoples used such methods to survive. He wasn't above it now. Further on, he found bear tracks leading to a shallow cave. Fear kept him from going near, but curiosity made him circle it at a distance. The tracks were fresh, and inside, he glimpsed bones, small, likely deer. A kill site. Dangerous, but informative. Where there are predators, there is prey. Where there is prey, there is food. He turned back toward the creek and followed it into a marshy area. Water pooled around his boots, soaking through the torn leather. But near the edge of the marsh, he found cattails, edible if prepared correctly. He yanked one from the mud, peeled back the outer layers, and bit into the tender core. Starchy, filling, another win. That night, with a belly full of insects, pine shreds, and cattails, he felt something that almost resembled hope. He made a nest of dry grass beneath a bent tree and covered himself with damp but thick branches. It was not comfortable, but it was a shelter. The stars above seemed closer somehow. He stared at them for a long time, tracing imaginary constellations. One looked like his son's toy horse, another like the shape of a lantern. He spoke aloud, quietly, to no one and to everyone. If you're looking for me, I'm still alive. His voice was hoarse, but it didn't crack. And in the middle of that vast, uncaring wilderness, the man who should have died days ago drifted into sleep, alive, fed, and determined. By the time Truman Everts awoke, the early light had already begun to warm the tips of the trees. His makeshift nest had done little to stop the damp chill that sank deep into his bones, but he had made it through the night once again. The air smelled clean, alive with the scent of wet earth and pine. It was a new day, and he was determined not to let it go to waste. He limped along the edge of the marshland, grateful for the modest nourishment the cattails had provided. He would look for more, and for any signs of animal life that might lead to a fresher source of sustenance. His boots squelched with every step soaked through beyond repair. Still he pressed on. Mid-morning brought a surprise, the discovery of something man-made. Near the roots of a fallen tree, half buried in mud and leaves, was a leather-bound book. He recognized it instantly. It was his own journal, the one he'd lost during the frantic first day when his pack mule had bolted. The cover was water-stained, its edges gnawed by time and weather, but it was intact. Tears welled in his eyes, not from sentimentality, but from what the journal represented: hope, planning, memory. And within it, carefully folded, was a page that made his hands tremble. A map, crude, sketched in pencil and ink. It didn't cover all of Yellowstone, but it marked significant features the expedition had already passed: rivers, peaks. A particular formation he recalled vividly: the split-topped butte near the geothermal basin. He could place himself now, not with certainty, but with possibility. The discovery ignited a spark within him, a plan. If he could orient himself to that butte, he could follow the ridgeline back toward the last known camp location. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too far. With renewed purpose, he climbed out of the marsh and into drier terrain, using his fingers to trace the rough landmarks as he walked. The terrain was brutal: fallen trees, loose rocks, sharp inclines. But the drive to follow the map pushed him forward. At midday, he rested beneath a tall pine and studied the paper again. There were markings from other explorers, notations of hot springs and safe trails. He remembered their laughter as they scribbled, poking fun at each other's sense of direction. Those memories warmed him in a way fire no longer could. He resumed walking, but with focus now. The sun became his guide, the map his anchor. Though he was still weak, still shivering, his mind was sharp. The weather shifted again in the afternoon. The sky darkened, and wind whispered through the trees like a warning. He had no shelter in sight, but he pressed forward, determined to reach a plateau he believed would give him a clear view of the land. He made it as the first drops began to fall. Standing atop the rocky rise, wind tugging at his ragged clothes, he looked out across miles of forest. And there it was, the butte. Far off, barely visible through mist and distance, but distinct. A twin-headed tower of stone, exactly where the map had placed it. Relief overwhelmed him. He laughed, a rasping sound that startled nearby birds into flight. Then lightning cracked across the sky, and rain came like a curtain. Everts ran for cover, sliding down the slope, feet skidding on wet leaves and gravel. He found a hollow between two tree roots and curled into it, wrapping the journal beneath his shirt to protect it. The storm raged for hours, but it couldn't touch what he now held inside: direction. He had a destination, he had a route, he had hope, and that, more than any meal or shelter, was enough to carry him into another day. The next morning came with a sky as gray as iron and an air heavy with the threat of more rain. Truman Everts lay beneath the tree roots, his journal still pressed against his chest. His body ached from the cold, but his mind had found clarity. He knew where he needed to go. That vision of the butte had lit a fire within him stronger than any flame. He stood, slowly shaking out his limbs, and checked the journal again. The ink had blurred slightly, but the map was legible. He folded it carefully and tucked it deep within his shirt. Then he began the climb toward the butte, now serving as both a beacon and a lifeline. The forest around him had changed. Trees grew wider apart here, and the ground was more open, covered with dense shrubs and slick moss. He walked with caution, avoiding loose rock and hidden holes. He had learned by now that Yellowstone gave no second chances. Hunger gnawed at him, sharper now that his body sensed a goal. He chewed what he could: pine bark, the core of cattails, a few remaining wild onions he had hoarded in his pouch. The grubs were gone. No more luck with squirrels or birds. His stomach cramped, not from illness, but from emptiness. By midday, the sky darkened further. The wind picked up, tugging at his tattered coat and howling through the trees. Rain came in sheets, cold, stinging, relentless. Within minutes, he was soaked through, his skin trembling beneath layers of wet fabric. He tried to find shelter, but there was none. The trees offered little. The ground was turning to mud. He kept moving. Lightning forked across the sky. The thunder followed in seconds. He dropped to the ground, shielding his head with his arms, then scrambled forward again. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to hunker down. But he wouldn't. Not with the butte ahead, not with a chance of escape. His boots slipped on a rock ledge. He fell, sliding partway down a slope, arms flailing. His side struck a jagged stone, and pain exploded across his ribs. He lay there, stunned, gasping. Then, groaning, he crawled to his knees. Blood soaked his shirt, but the wound didn't seem deep. Just brutal. Rain streamed down his face, mingling with sweat and tears. "Not now," he muttered. "Not now. Not here." He pulled himself upright, leaning against a birch tree until the dizziness passed. Then he limped forward. One step, then another. Hours passed like years. The storm never let up. At times he thought he heard voices, search parties calling out his name, but they vanished like ghosts on the wind. He was alone. At last, as the sky dimmed and twilight crept over the horizon, he saw it again. The butte, closer now. Not a mirage, a real towering formation of stone, and more importantly, the land around it flattened. Safer ground. If he could reach it, he could rest. Maybe even light a signal fire if he found anything dry. He stumbled forward until his legs gave out. He collapsed beside a fallen log and didn't rise. His breaths came in ragged, shallow gasps. The pain in his ribs was worse now, each inhale a dagger. But his eyes never left the silhouette of the butte. He reached out a trembling hand and whispered to the wind, "Almost there." And as the storm rolled over the valley, Truman Everts closed his eyes beneath the clouds, clutching hope like a shield. When Truman Everts awoke, the rain had finally stopped. The forest was silent, holding its breath. He stirred slowly, every part of his body aching. His side burned from the injury sustained during his fall, and his limbs were stiff with cold. But his mind was clear, and through the trees, bathed in the morning's soft light, the butte still stood. He forced himself to sit up, biting down against a wave of dizziness. The night had been punishing. He didn't remember falling asleep, only the darkness swallowing him. Yet here he was, still breathing, still moving. The sky was patchy blue now, and the air held the clean, sharp smell that follows a storm. The earth was soaked, but a faint warmth began to return with the sun's rays breaking through the canopy. His journal, miraculously, had remained dry under his shirt. He opened it, checked the map again. He was close, a half-day's walk, perhaps less. Encouraged, he gathered his strength and began the final push. He walked slowly, conserving energy. The wound on his ribs had stopped bleeding, but the skin was raw, and every step sent a twinge through his body. He leaned on a thick stick for balance, using it like a cane. He passed through groves of lodgepole pine, their needles glittering with rain. Squirrels watched him from branches above, twitching nervously. Food was scarce, but he found another patch of cattails and stripped a few roots to chew. Bitter, fibrous, but filling. The familiar pangs of hunger were now a constant background noise. Less pain, more pressure. By midday, he reached the base of the butte. Its massive stone face rose like a monument, towering over the valley below. From this vantage point, he could see far across the wilderness. Forests stretched endlessly, broken by rivers and steaming basins. He scanned the horizon for signs of life, movement, smoke, anything. Nothing. But he had something else now. Elevation. He remembered the plan they had discussed before the expedition split. If anyone got lost, a signal fire was the best hope. High ground, visible smoke. That's what would save them. He began gathering dry wood. It was a slow, painful task. Everything was damp from the storm, but he found broken branches beneath thick trees, dry on the underside. He arranged them in a pyramid on a flat slab near the edge of the cliff. He still had no matches, no flint. but he had his glasses. It was a desperate idea, using the lens to focus sunlight. He positioned the glass, angling it toward the driest bark. For an hour he sat like that, motionless, adjusting, waiting. The sun shifted. Nothing. Then smoke. He held his breath. A tiny wisp, then another, a flicker of flame. It caught slowly, then suddenly surged. The fire was real. Everts fed it carefully, protecting the flame from sudden gusts. When the smoke thickened, he piled on more moss and wet needles, damp enough to create white plumes. He stood back and watched the smoke rise into the sky, twisting like a ribbon. He waited. Minutes passed. An hour. His legs trembled. He sat, watching the trail of smoke dissolve into the heavens. Then, in the distance, movement. A flicker of reflection, something metallic, a flash. Then another. Someone was signaling back. He didn't believe it at first. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, but the flashes came again. Deliberate, rhythmic, not the sun through trees, but a mirror, a man-made mirror. His signal had been seen. Tears welled in his eyes as he stumbled to his feet and waved both arms, shouting at the sky, at the forest, at the miracle. They knew he was alive. He collapsed beside the fire, sobbing with joy and pain, the butte behind him, smoke above, and rescue finally within reach. Even as Truman Everts celebrated the miracle of being seen, he knew rescue wouldn't be immediate. The mirror flashes had come from far off, too distant for a voice to carry, too far for help to arrive in minutes. Still, it was a turning point. He wasn't just a ghost in the forest anymore. Someone knew he was alive. The fire was still burning strong, but the smoke had begun to thin. He fed it more damp moss, careful not to smother the flames. The thick white plumes billowed once again into the sky. He added bark, pine needles, and anything he could find. He even tore off the last dry strip of his shirt to keep the fire alive. Everything now was about being seen, staying visible. The sun began to drop toward the west. Evening light painted the treetops in gold. Everts stayed close to the fire, conserving his strength. He drank from a puddle collected in the rock. It wasn't clean, but it was wet, and that was enough. As darkness crept in, the reality set in. He would have to spend another night alone. He found a small crevice near the base of the butte, just large enough to curl into. He lined it with pine needles and rested, the fire's glow flickering just out of sight. Every sound in the night seemed louder than before, every owl's call, every rustle in the brush. He held his journal close and whispered to himself, "They saw me. They're coming." The dawn came with frost on the ground and a light fog across the trees. He checked the fire, burned to embers. He blew gently and rekindled it using bark and the last of his dry moss. Again smoke curled skyward. Again he waited. By mid-morning, he heard something. Distant, muffled, but unmistakable. Voices. He leapt up, ignoring the pain in his ribs. He shouted, waving his arms wildly. "Hello! Over here!" The voices stopped. Then one returned, closer, clearer. "Truman? Is that you?" It was like being struck by lightning, only warm. He shouted again, laughing and crying at the same time. Through the trees, two men appeared, muddy, bearded, armed with rifles and packs, members of the original expedition. Their eyes went wide at the sight of him. "My God," one whispered, "you're alive!" They rushed forward, wrapping him in a blanket, handing him a tin cup of lukewarm broth. He drank greedily, choking on the taste of salt and life. His legs gave out, and he sat down hard, holding the cup like it was gold. "You've been gone for over 3 weeks," the other man said. "We thought you were dead." "I almost was," Everts rasped. They told him they'd seen the smoke from miles off, then the glint of the signal. It had taken hours to climb up through the dense forest. They had been scouring the area for days, but Yellowstone was vast. He tried to speak, but his throat failed him. Instead, he handed them the journal. They read in silence for a while, their faces tightening with each page. "You kept this going the whole time?" one asked. He nodded. "You'll be famous," the other said, half grinning. "They'll write books about this." But Truman didn't care about fame. All he wanted was to go home. They made a stretcher from fallen branches and coats. Carefully, they lifted him and began the slow journey back toward the camp. As they moved down the trail, the butte faded behind them. The valley opened wide, and for the first time in nearly a month, Truman Everts was no longer alone. Truman Everts drifted in and out of consciousness as the men carried him through the wilds of Yellowstone. His body, relieved of the pressure to survive alone, began to fail him. His muscles cramped, his fever returned, and chills racked his frame. It was as though every ounce of strength had been spent getting to the butte, to that fire, to that moment of rescue. The men, Will and Hartley, both seasoned and quiet, took turns at the ends of the stretcher. They moved slowly, winding through dense underbrush and navigating narrow trails. They wrapped Everts in extra coats, shielding him from the cold as best they could. "You weigh less than a sack of grain," Hartley muttered at one point, trying to lighten the mood. Everts managed a weak smile. He didn't speak often, his throat was too raw, and his energy had to be conserved. But inside, he clung to the presence of other people like a lifeline. Just hearing voices again had a strange power. It rooted him in reality, pulled him back from the edge. The journey was brutal. They had to cross 2 streams, one of which rose to their thighs. Hartley nearly lost his footing in the current, and the cold water soaked through Everts' blankets. He shivered violently afterward, teeth chattering uncontrollably. Will built a fire on the bank and forced hot broth into his mouth, spoonful by spoonful, until the color returned to his cheeks. They spoke of the search. "We never gave up," Will said as he fed the fire. "When you didn't return, we assumed you'd just gone off trail, maybe a day or 2 behind. Then after a week, well, we still didn't want to believe it. You were always stubborn," Hartley added. "We figured if anyone could stay alive out here by sheer force of will, it'd be you." Everts tried to speak, but the words came as whispers. "Map. Journal. Fire." "We found your notes," Will said gently. "We'll get them back to camp, back to the world." The next day brought a snowfall, thin at first, then thickening as the sky turned silver. The landscape transformed, softened, muted. Every branch bore a coat of white. The trail became slick and dangerous. The men slipped often and they had to rest frequently. Still, they pressed on. Everts hallucinated at times. He saw his children walking beside him, heard their laughter echo through the trees. Once he thought he saw a lantern hanging from a tree limb swinging gently in the wind. But when he blinked, it was gone. That night, they sheltered in a grove of tightly packed trees where the snow couldn't reach. Will and Hartley took turns keeping the fire alive. Everts slept in short bursts, plagued by fevered dreams of boiling geysers and endless pine forests. On the 3rd day of travel, they reached the edge of the main camp. A scout saw them first, then ran to alert the others. Within minutes, voices erupted from the tents. Men came running, shouting Everts' name. Some were laughing, some crying. One man knelt and gripped Everts' hand, unable to speak. He was lifted from the stretcher and placed in a proper tent. Clean blankets, warm food, a basin of hot water, and, most blessed of all, silence broken only by friendly voices. He slept for nearly 12 hours. When he woke, weak but clear-headed, the expedition leader sat beside him. The man leaned forward, resting a hand on Truman's shoulder. "You survived what no man should have survived. You were alone for 37 days, Everts nodded slowly. "I wasn't alone," he whispered. "I had the forest and memories." The man smiled. "And now, you have a second chance." For the first time in over a month, Truman Everts felt warm, not from fire or shelter, but from the presence of others and from the knowledge that his ordeal, though not yet fully over, had found a turning point. The tent was quiet except for the crackle of the small camp stove and the low murmur of voices outside. Truman Everts lay on a bedroll covered in thick wool blankets, his body wrapped in layers that smelled of smoke and leather. His limbs ached, his skin burned with fever, and his stomach churned with every sip of broth, but he was alive. Alive. And finally not alone. For the first time in 37 days, he didn't wake up cold, wet, or afraid. The fire inside the tent held the night at bay, and the quiet presence of others gave him a sense of security he hadn't felt since leaving the expedition's main trail. Each hour brought a new face. Fellow expedition members stopped by, bringing more than food or supplies. They brought familiarity. They sat beside him, told him news of the outside world, recounted camp stories, and gently reminded him that the world had not forgotten him. Will returned often. He became Everts' caretaker and guardian. He cleaned the wound on Truman's ribs twice a day, replaced the soaked bandages, and gently massaged the joints in his hands and legs so they wouldn't lock up. Hartley brought food in small doses: broth, weak tea, crushed berries. The first time Everts managed to keep everything down, the entire tent clapped like he'd performed a miracle. And in a way, he had. His weight had dropped to nearly 90 pounds. His bones protruded at sharp angles, his eyes were sunken, and his hair had turned brittle. But the men didn't treat him like a ghost, they treated him like a survivor. On the 5th day, he was able to sit up without help. He asked for his journal. Will handed it to him with a reverence usually reserved for holy books. "It's all here," he said. "We didn't change a thing." Everts opened the worn leather cover and ran a trembling finger down the first page. Mud-streaked, blood-spattered, ink blurred. But it was intact. Every word, every observation, every desperate scribble. He began reading it aloud, not for the others but for himself, to remind his mind what his body had endured, to reconnect with the part of him that had kept going when everything else had screamed to stop. The men listened in silence. When he reached the chapter about the bear, the one that had passed within feet of his shelter, they all leaned forward. "You could have been torn apart," Hartley muttered. "I wasn't," Everts said hoarsely, because I stayed still, because I trusted silence." They didn't laugh. No one mocked him. These were men who understood danger, who respected survival. That night, he wrote a new page in his journal. It wasn't about hardship or hunger. It wasn't about the freezing nights or maddening isolation. It was about gratitude. Gratitude for the hands that carried him, for the voices that called out, for the fire, the signal, the hope, for memory, for the forest that had tried to kill him and somehow, in its own cruel way, had kept him alive. In the weeks to come, Truman Everts would be moved to a proper shelter, and eventually he would return to civilization. But for now, as snow gently fell on the canvas roof of the tent, he let his thoughts rest. Not on what he'd lost, but on what he'd gained. Though the men brought Truman Everts comfort and warmth, there were parts of him that hadn't yet returned from the wilderness. His body lay safe beneath canvas and blankets, but his mind still drifted somewhere in the pine shadows, listening to the wind whistle through dead branches. During the nights when the fire burned low and the camp quieted into a hush, the silence took on a different tone. No longer dangerous, but not quite friendly. Truman would lie awake, staring into the dark corners of the tent, his ears searching for sounds he'd grown used to. The rustle of leaves, the sudden crack of a twig, the distant howl of wolves. He missed them. Not because he wanted to return, but because those sounds had become a rhythm to him, a heartbeat. Out there, alone, nature had shaped the hours. Daylight and birdsong told him when to rise. Cold and moonlight told him when to sleep. It had been brutal, yes, but it had also been honest. Now, surrounded by men and their muttered conversations, by the clank of utensils and the coughs of a nearby tent, Everts sometimes felt lost again. The world was too loud in some ways, too distant in others. He tried to explain it to Will one morning. "When you're out there, it's like the forest speaks to you, but it doesn't use words, just presence." Will nodded slowly. "You're not the first man I've seen come back quieter. It gets inside you, the wild. Doesn't let go easy." Everts smiled faintly. "No, it doesn't." His appetite improved. With food came strength, and with strength came clarity. He began walking short distances with help. The first time he stepped outside the tent, the sun hit his face like a warm slap. He had grown pale and gaunt, but the light stirred something deep within him. The snow on the ground had already begun to melt. Steam rose from the nearby hot springs. The air smelled of ash and sulfur, and far off, the butte still stood like a monument to his survival. He kept his journal with him, always, and though he had written dozens of entries during his time alone, he began adding new reflections, things he hadn't noticed before, how the color of the trees changed in different light, how silence could be a comfort, how hunger teaches more than indulgence ever could. Visitors came from nearby camps, scouts, surveyors, curious strangers who had heard whispers of the man who lived 37 days alone. Some asked questions, others simply sat with him, perhaps hoping his silence would give them some kind of answer they couldn't name. To most, Truman was a miracle. To himself, he was simply changed. One night, he asked Will to light a fire just beyond the camp's edge. They sat beside it in the dark, not speaking. The flames crackled and danced, and for a long time Truman stared into them. "Out there," he said softly, "I thought I would die. I almost did. But in those moments when I truly believed I was gone, something inside me started fighting. Not just to live, but to witness, to remember." Will tossed another branch into the fire. "And now?" Truman didn't answer immediately. He watched the sparks rise and disappear into the stars. "Now," he said, "I think I'm still learning what that fight really meant." As Truman Everts continued to heal, the story of his survival began to spread beyond the camp. Word reached nearby forts and settlements. Men rode in from distant outposts just to see him, to look into the face of the man who had endured what most would not have survived. Some brought questions. What had he eaten? Where had he slept? Did he ever lose hope? Others brought praise, admiration, even tears. To them, he was no longer just a man. He was legend. But Truman felt none of it. He was grateful, yes, humbled, but the stories people told weren't the ones he remembered. They spoke of his strength, his willpower, his miracle. Truman, meanwhile, remembered crawling on frostbitten knees, hallucinating voices in the trees, trembling with starvation. He remembered bargaining with the silence and whispering goodbyes to no one at all. He found it hard to explain that his greatest achievement wasn't surviving the wilderness, but surviving himself. One evening, Hartley brought him a mirror. It had belonged to one of the camp's supply officers. "You haven't seen yourself since we found you," he said gently. Truman hesitated. Then, slowly, he lifted the mirror. The face staring back was gaunt and sunken. His cheeks were hollow, lips cracked, skin pale and weathered like bark. His eyes, once bright and full of careful thought, looked older. Not just tired, but different. Like he had looked through something the rest hadn't. He set the mirror down. "It's strange," he said. "I don't recognize that man." "You're still in there," Hartley replied, "just reshaped." In the following days, Truman began to speak more about his journey. Not to impress, but to process. Around the campfire, he told parts of the story that weren't in the journal. How he'd once chased a flicker of light he thought was a cabin window only to find a steaming hot spring. How the wind would sometimes sound like a woman singing. How the stars began to feel like old friends. One night, a scout named Benjamin asked him, "Were you ever afraid you'd forget how to speak?" Truman chuckled dryly. "I was more afraid I'd forget how to think, how to be someone." Each story he shared became less about survival and more about reflection. It was as though the forest had carved something into him, and now, day by day, he was learning how to live with it. He wrote more often, his journal filling with new observations. Not about danger or hunger, but about meaning, about how a man measures a life after nearly losing it, about what it feels like to have nothing and then to be given a second chance. One entry read, "I wonder if the trees remember me, if the silence that once terrified me would welcome me back. I walk through fire, storm, starvation, and shadow, and though I am home, part of me is still walking." Another night, he sat with Will under the same butte where he had lit the signal fire. "I used to think survival was a single act," Truman said. "A moment, a choice. But now I think it's many things. It's waking up when you'd rather not. It's taking one more step. It's letting someone carry you when you can't stand." Will didn't reply. He simply passed Truman a canteen and watched the sun set over the vast, wild land. And for a moment, Truman Everts didn't feel like a man returning from the woods. He felt like a man becoming whole. As the snows melted and the river ice broke, the landscape around the camp changed once more. The forests came alive again, green and humming, almost unaware of the quiet miracle that had unfolded beneath their boughs. But Truman Everts remained still recovering, still processing. The physical wounds were healing, the fever had broken, his weight had stabilized. He now walked with less assistance, though a carved cane gifted by one of the men became a constant companion. But even more noticeable than his improved gait was the growing sharpness in his voice, the way he spoke with clarity, as if he had spent weeks rewriting the story of his life. What had begun as quiet journaling turned into pages upon pages. He wrote with a passion that surprised even himself, long entries, diagrams, musings on human nature, and the unrelenting forces of wilderness. His journal became something more than a survival log. It became a manuscript. Each evening, men gathered around to hear the latest entries. Truman read aloud slowly, his voice sometimes faltering, sometimes surprisingly strong. His words painted scenes of suffering, yes, but also deep beauty. The way light moved through steam at dawn, the silence that hung after snowfall, the dignity of creatures surviving just as he had. His audience grew. Word spread to nearby settlements. One morning, a man rode in from Fort Ellis, bringing letters from officials who had heard of the ordeal. One letter was from a journalist in Helena asking for an interview. Another was from the Smithsonian, inquiring if Truman might document his experience for their archives. Will grinned when he read them aloud. "Looks like the world's catching up to your story." Truman didn't smile. He only said, "Then I better tell it right." Still, he hesitated at the idea of leaving. The camp had become more than shelter. It had become a sanctuary, a place where his transformation felt safe, understood. Civilization loomed on the horizon, and he wasn't sure he was ready to meet it. One evening, he and Hartley took a walk to the edge of a ridge overlooking a wide valley. The air was brisk and their breath misted as they spoke. "You planning to go back east?" Hartley asked. "I don't know," Truman replied. "I'm not sure where I belong yet. There's a part of me that feels like it's still out there, in the forest, under a pine somewhere." Hartley nodded. "Then maybe you're meant to stay. Make sense of it here. Not everything has to be left behind." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of distant smoke. It reminded Truman of that moment atop the butte, where his fire had reached the sky and been seen. That plume had been a call to the world, yes, but maybe also a question. What comes after survival? The next morning, Truman began organizing his notes into chapters. He wrote by the fire, by the river, beneath trees. He wrote with a focus he'd never known, no longer for his own sanity, but for clarity, for legacy. He believed that what he had endured had to mean something, not just for himself, but for anyone who might one day be lost in their own wilderness. His journal now held titles like "The Day the Fire Died," "The False Smoke," and "The Bear's Silence." He described not just the actions, but the emotions, the terror, the shame, the small triumphs that tasted sweeter than any feast. One chapter ended with the line, "It wasn't starvation that hollowed me out. It was the realization that I might die unseen, that all this, my thoughts, my life, could vanish into pine needles and silence." He let Will and Hartley read the draft. Both men were quiet for a long time afterward. "It's not just survival," Will said finally. "It's a reckoning." Truman nodded. "That's what it became. Out there, I didn't just fight the forest. I fought the question of whether I mattered." Now each stroke of his pen was a defiant answer. He mattered. The wilderness had tested him, tried to erase him, to fold him into its relentless rhythm, but he had left a mark in ash, in pine, in memory, and now in ink. Truman Everts sat at the edge of the river, his cane resting across his knees, a half-filled page fluttering beneath his hand. Morning light danced on the water, and the sound of the current blended with the occasional bird call from the trees. Around him, the camp stirred slowly, pots clanked, boots shuffled, someone coughed. But in his corner of the world, all was still. He'd been thinking of his children. For days, their faces had begun to come back to him more clearly. Shapes once distorted by hunger and fever, now restored by warmth and clarity. He remembered the way his daughter laughed when she tried to whistle, the way his son used to walk 3 steps behind him, imitating his every move. He remembered the letter he had promised to write the moment he returned. And now, seated by this wild river that had nearly swallowed him, he began. My dearest Clara and Thomas, he wrote, the tip of the pen scratching carefully across the page. You will not recognize the man who sends this letter. He is changed, thinner, older, and quieter, but he is still your father. And he is coming home. His hand trembled as he wrote, not from weakness, but from the weight of the words. Every sentence was a reconciliation, not only with his family, but with the time he had lost, with the man he had become in the forest. He wrote of the journey, how he had wandered from the group, how he had survived alone. He described the animals, the frost, the hunger, the hallucinations. But he also wrote of small victories, the fire he coaxed from a sunbeam, the cattails that filled his stomach, the butte that stood like a lighthouse in the fog. And then he paused. He looked up at the trees swaying gently above him. For all his words, there were still things he couldn't quite express. How do you explain what it means to sleep with death as your blanket and memory as your pillow? How do you convey the intimate terror of being forgotten? He turned to the next page. What I want you to understand, he continued, is that I did not survive because I am brave, or strong, or wise. I survived because I refused to disappear, because each night I whispered your names into the darkness, and each morning I walked one more mile because I imagined your faces waiting at the end of the trail. He wrote for hours. His letter grew into something like a journal, something like a confession. He wrote not just to tell them he was alive, but to make sense of what it meant. That afternoon, Will found him still sitting by the river. You're going to need a bigger envelope, Will joked. Truman chuckled, carefully setting the pages aside. It turns out I had a lot to say. Later that evening, he read excerpts of the letter aloud by the fire. The men listened with bowed heads, the flames dancing across their faces. None interrupted. None asked questions. When he finished, the silence lingered. Hartley finally said, They're going to be proud of you. Not because you lived, but because you remembered. Truman nodded slowly. That's all I wanted, to not vanish, to not let what happened fade into the trees. The next day he bundled the letter and entrusted it to a rider heading back toward civilization. Watching the man gallop away, a strange finality settled over Truman. It wasn't the end of his story, not yet, but it was the beginning of something else, a return. In the days that followed, he continued to write. But he also began walking farther, testing the strength in his legs. He ventured down paths he had once feared. Not alone now, but always with a journal in his coat. He returned to the butte one last time. Standing at its base, he looked up at the place where he had lit the signal fire. He touched the charred remains of the stones that still sat in a circle, blackened by the smoke that had saved him. Around him, the wilderness moved as it always had, indifferent, eternal. But he was no longer invisible to it. He had left his mark. And now, he was ready to go home. The day Truman Everts left the Yellowstone camp was neither grand nor ceremonial. No speeches were given, no flags waved, yet the silence held something sacred. Men stood with hats in hand as he stepped into the saddle of a gentle mare provided by the survey crew. He sat upright, but leaned slightly on his cane, which he had strapped across his back. His bags were light, just a change of clothes, his journals, and a few letters tucked into the pages. Will rode beside him. Feels strange, Everts said, glancing back at the slowly receding outline of the camp. Like I'm leaving a part of myself behind. You are, Will replied, but you're carrying the rest forward. The journey back to Helena would take several days. The terrain, though more forgiving than the heart of Yellowstone, was still no gentle path. Snowmelt had turned the lower trails into muddy corridors. Streams overflowed their banks, fallen trees forced frequent detours. But Truman was used to hardship now. He did not complain. He did not tire easily. What he did do was observe. He took in the landscape with a reverence that bordered on holy. Every pine, every bubbling creek, every hawk overhead seemed to him a part of something vast and alive, something he had not only survived, but come to know intimately. Where before he had seen trees, now he saw shelter. Where he once feared stillness, now he welcomed it. Each night they camped simply. Will built a small fire, and Truman warmed his hands over the flame as he wrote. He captured everything: the shifting sky, the bruised twilight, the haunting cry of a loon far off across a glacial lake. He was no longer writing only to record what had been. He was writing to understand what still remained within him. On the fourth evening, as they sat beneath a canvas lean-to, Will turned to him. "When this gets published, what will you say it was about?" Truman thought a long while. "Not survival," he said. "Endurance, maybe. Or faith. But not in a religious sense. Faith in motion, in memory. That if I just kept walking, something would find me, or I would find it." Will nodded. "That's something worth sharing." Truman looked at the stars. "I think we need to tell stories like that. Not just about strength, but about doubt. About the quiet things that carry us." They rode at dawn the next day, the world awash in gold and mist. By midday, they passed through small outposts where children pointed and whispered. Adults offered coffee, bread, and sometimes questions Truman wasn't ready to answer. At one homestead, a woman placed a hand over her heart as Truman dismounted. "You're him, aren't you?" she asked. He offered a small smile. "I'm someone who got lost." "But you came back." "Yes," he said, "I did." By the time they reached Helena, word had spread. Reporters waited with notebooks and cameras. A man from the Territorial Dispatch stepped forward, tipping his hat. "Mr. Everts," he said, "we've heard your story. May we publish it?" Truman hesitated. Then he unstrapped his journal and handed it over. "Publish it," he said, "but don't polish it. Let it stay ragged. The truth usually is." They guided him to a room above a general store where he could rest. It was the first bed he'd slept in for over 40 nights, yet even with clean sheets and warm walls, sleep didn't come easily. The air felt too still, the world too padded. He missed the ache in his muscles, the pine in his nose, the voice inside him that had grown strong through silence. So he opened a new journal, and he began to write again. The days in Helena passed slowly. For Truman Everts, each hour felt suspended, hovering somewhere between relief and restlessness. The frontier town buzzed around him. Wagons rumbled through muddy streets. Merchants called from doorways. Children darted past him in laughter. He watched it all from a bench beneath the wooden awning of the general store, his cane resting upright between his knees. He was home, in the loosest sense of the word. Civilization had reaccepted him, yet he didn't quite fit inside it. Something in him had changed shape, something he wasn't sure could change back. Everywhere he went, people stared. Some greeted him with reverence, others with curiosity, a few with pity. None could see the days and nights he had endured etched deep behind his eyes. He kept his head down, his journal under his arm. He walked with effort, not just because his legs still ached, but because each step brought him closer to the realization that he had returned to a world that would never fully understand what he had survived. One morning, a local photographer approached him outside the post office. "Mr. Everts," the man said, tipping his hat, "I'd be honored to take your portrait. People are eager to see the face of a man who's beaten death." Truman hesitated, then nodded. "I suppose death didn't put up much of a fight. Just waited to see if I'd quit." The portrait studio smelled of varnish and old cloth. Truman sat stiffly in the high-backed chair, one hand resting on his knee, the other gripping the cane. The photographer adjusted the light, positioned his lens, then disappeared beneath the black cloth. "Try to think of something pleasant," he said. Truman thought of fire, of frost, of his daughter's voice calling his name in a dream. The shutter clicked. That afternoon, Truman stared at the small daguerreotype in his hand. The man in the image was pale, hollow-cheeked, eyes sunken, but burning with a strange defiance. It didn't look like a man who had been rescued. It looked like a man who had rescued something from himself. He slipped the photo into his journal. That night, he was invited to speak at a gathering in the hall above the blacksmith's shop. Townsfolk crammed onto benches, eager to hear the tale firsthand. The room smelled of sweat, pipe smoke, and anticipation. Truman stood at the front, clutching the podium like a lifeline. "I didn't come here to tell a story," he began. "I came to tell the truth." He spoke for over an hour. He described the landscape, the hunger, the hallucinations. He described sleeping beneath trees slick with ice and hiding from a bear whose breath fogged the air mere feet from his face. He spoke of the stream that gave him water, of the patch of berries that kept him sane, of the fire he sparked with a lens and a sliver of sun. He paused often. The audience listened in silence. Then he said, "But the hardest part wasn't the cold. It wasn't the pain. It was knowing I might vanish and no one would ever know I'd been there, that the forest would swallow my bones and I'd be nothing but wind through trees." A woman in the front row wiped her eyes. "But now you know. You all know. And that means I didn't disappear." The crowd rose to its feet in applause. Some shook his hand. Others simply nodded, as though unsure how to process the weight of his words. Later, back in his rented room, Truman stared out the window at the flickering oil lamps lining the street. His journal lay open beside him. He dipped his pen in ink and wrote, "Today, I was seen. Not just for the man who returned, but for the man who endured." The following morning, a letter arrived bearing the seal of the U.S. Department of the Interior. The Yellowstone expedition was gaining interest in Washington. They wanted Truman's full account for a formal report. It was official now. His story wasn't just survival. It was history. Truman folded the letter and placed it in his coat. He picked up his cane, checked the pages of his journal, and began walking. Not away from what he'd been through, but into whatever came next. He wasn't afraid of the unknown anymore. He had walked through it, starved inside it, and found himself again within it. And now he was ready to meet the world. Truman Everts awoke before dawn. The city of Helena was still wrapped in the quiet gray of early morning, the kind of silence he had once known too well. But this silence was different, too still, too padded, lacking the raw pulse of wilderness. He missed the forest's breath, even its danger. His small, rented room above the general store was barely furnished, a bed, a desk, and a cracked mirror, but it was enough. Enough to write, enough to remember. He lit a lamp and sat at the desk. The journal, now bulging with days of survival and nights of reflection, lay open before him. Next to it, a crisp sheet of stationery marked with the letterhead of the Department of the Interior. His official account would be read in Washington. Politicians and surveyors, cartographers and cabinet men who'd never set foot in Yellowstone, would read his words and try to understand what Yellowstone was, what it did to a man, what it gave. He dipped his pen and began. "To the Honorable Secretary of the Interior," he wrote, "what follows is not merely an account of a lost man's ordeal, but a declaration of the raw, untamed, and sometimes indifferent wilderness that lies within the Yellowstone region. It is both a place of death and of grace, and I am its proof." He worked for hours. He referenced his notes and journals, rewriting episodes he had already relived too many times. His pen moved slowly, deliberately. There was no room for embellishment here, only clarity. He wrote about the way hunger became a voice, how hallucinations could wear the face of hope, how silence could press harder than any storm. When he paused for breath, he found his hand aching. His knuckles were stiff, the result of weeks of exposure. He flexed them carefully, rubbed them, and continued. By noon, the document had taken shape. More than a report, it was a testimony. He stood stretched and stepped out onto the balcony. Below, the town was coming to life. A boy swept the stoop of the bakery. A woman led a goat by a frayed rope. Wagons clattered over frozen ruts. Life had gone on while he was gone. It would continue long after him. He returned inside, folded the report, and slid it into an envelope. It was time to deliver it. He descended the stairs slowly, the wooden steps creaking beneath his boots. Outside, he tucked the envelope beneath his coat and began walking to the post office. Halfway there, he passed the telegraph office. He paused. A memory returned. The moment he first saw the signal fire's smoke, their smoke, rising through the trees, that moment when he knew for the first time in 37 days that he might not die alone. He entered the office. "I'd like to send a message," he told the clerk. "To whom?" He hesitated. "To my children." The clerk nodded. Truman scribbled a brief note on the slip. "Alive. Coming home soon. I never stop thinking of you. Father." The message sent, Truman stepped back into the street. The post office was just ahead. He entered and handed the letter to the clerk. "This is going to Washington," he said. "It's important." He returned to his room in the afternoon, exhausted not by distance but by emotion. He had done what he came to do. But a question remained. What next? He sat by the window as twilight approached. The sun dipped below the rooftops, casting golden shadows across the snow. His journal lay on the desk, pages open like an invitation. So he picked up the pen again. But this time, he didn't write about Yellowstone. He wrote about home. He wrote about what he missed: the smell of bread in the oven, the sound of rain on a real roof, the warmth of a child's hand in his own. He described not events but dreams, the life he would return to, the ordinary things now made sacred by their absence. That night, he fell asleep with the pen still in his hand, his journal open to a fresh page that read, "I have walked through a land of fire and frost. I have learned the language of silence. And now, I must learn to live again." And for the first time in many weeks, Truman Everts slept without dreaming of trees. In the days that followed the delivery of his official report, Truman Everts found himself caught between two worlds. On one hand, the warm streets and structured days of Helena gave him security, order, and the comfort of human company. On the other, his dreams remained in the wilderness. He would wake at dawn and stare at the thin line of gray sky beyond his window, expecting the chill of pine needles or the hush of snow beneath his boots. But instead, he heard wagons and hooves, voices, and the creak of shop doors. At first, he welcomed the difference. Civilization was a balm. Food came hot and regular. Shelter was no longer a matter of improvisation, and there were no bears lurking behind tree trunks. But as time passed, he began to notice something strange. He missed the simplicity of survival, not the pain, nor the hunger, nor the isolation, but the clarity. Out there, every breath had mattered, every footstep was a decision, every meal a victory. In this world, he sometimes felt his senses dulling. The urgency had faded, and with it a piece of the person he had become during those 37 days. He began to walk more. Not far, his legs still ached when overused, but enough to circle the town to find the edges of Helena and peer into the woods beyond. He sought quiet corners. The alley behind the telegraph office, the grove near the cemetery where wind whispered through dry leaves. He found solace in small pockets of nature, fragments of the vastness he had survived. Word of his story continued to grow. One afternoon, a traveling preacher asked him to speak at a church gathering. "You were spared by providence," the preacher said. "The people would be moved to hear how God led you back." Truman accepted, though his relationship with divine intervention had become complicated. That Sunday, he stood before the small congregation in a wooden chapel. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows, casting warm beams across the pews. The townsfolk sat quietly, children on laps, bonnets in hands. "I was alone for 37 days, he began, "and I was not always sure I'd survive. But I want to be honest with you. I did not pray every day, and I did not always feel the presence of God. Sometimes I felt only wind, sometimes silence, sometimes hunger." A few gasps rose from the pews. He raised his hand gently. "But I did learn something sacred. I learned that life itself, the force that moves us to breathe, to walk, to try, is a kind of faith, and that faith doesn't always arrive as a miracle. Sometimes it arrives as a root in the ground or a spark from the sun." The room was silent. Then the preacher stood, laid a hand on Truman's shoulder, and said, "That, too, is holy." After the service, many came to shake his hand. An older woman wept. A young man asked if he could one day visit Yellowstone himself. "You've made it feel like something real," he said. Truman smiled. "It is. It's more real than anything I've ever known." Later that evening, he sat in his room, his journal open on the desk once again. He flipped back through the pages, through the days marked with cold, hunger, and desperate hope. He lingered on the day of the signal fire. On the moment the mirror flash returned from the horizon, that moment of impossible relief. He picked up his pen. There are places in the world that demand something from you. They do not offer comfort or shelter. They do not care whether you live or die. Yellowstone is such a place, but it gave me something, too, a mirror. It showed me who I really was when all else was stripped away. The next morning, he visited the printing office. The editor, a tall man with ink-stained hands, looked up as Truman entered. "Ah, Mr. Everts, we've been waiting for more of your account. Washington loved the first one." Truman nodded and handed over several pages. "There's more coming, but this part, it's not just facts and distances, it's about meaning. If you print it, let it breathe. Don't shorten it to fit the page." The editor smiled. "We wouldn't dare." As Truman left the office, the sky was beginning to cloud. He looked up and caught the scent of rain in the wind, faint but familiar. His fingers instinctively touched the coat pocket where he still carried a charred twig from the fire he had lit on the butte. A piece of that forest still walked with him, and perhaps it always would. By the end of his third week back in Helena, Truman Everts began to realize that healing was not a straight road. It twisted, sometimes reversed, and often circled back to memories he had thought buried. The physical pain faded more each day. He could now walk without the cane for short distances, and his appetite had returned with surprising vigor. He gained weight, his voice grew stronger, and his cheeks began to lose their hollow cast. But strength brought with it a strange weight, expectation. Everyone wanted to know what came next. Would he join another expedition, return to Washington with his report, settle down and begin a new life as a writer, a speaker, a man of fame? Truman didn't know. What he did know was that the more others spoke about his experience, the more he felt they were speaking of someone else. They told his story like it was a fable, a legend. The Truman Everts they saw was a symbol, an emblem of grit, determination, and miraculous survival. But Truman knew better. He had been afraid, broken, desperate, hopeful, humbled. He had been human. One morning, he walked alone to the edge of town. Beyond the last row of buildings and split-rail fences, the land dropped into a wide, rolling plain. Snow still clung in streaks to the higher ridges, and a pair of hawks circled overhead. The wind was gentle but cold, carrying the scent of pine and distant smoke. Truman sat on a large stone and took out his journal. He had no clear intention of what he meant to write. He simply let the pen move. In the wilderness, I met a version of myself I didn't know existed. He was not strong in the way of heroes, but in the way of roots, deep, unseen, stubborn. He was not always brave, but he moved forward even when his legs shook. He did not conquer the wild. He became part of it. The words flowed easily. He wrote for over an hour. By the time he stopped, his fingers were stained with ink, and the wind had picked up, curling the edges of the pages. That afternoon he received a visitor, a young man from the survey office in Bozeman, fresh-faced and eager. The man had read Truman's published accounts and had come with a simple request. "I'm leading a small mapping team through the northern stretch of Yellowstone," he said. "We'd be honored if you joined us, even briefly. Your knowledge of the terrain could make all the difference." Truman was silent for a long time. "I walked through that land with no map," he said, "and I still feel it beneath my skin. But if I return now, it wouldn't be the same journey. That man is still out there, thin, shivering, praying to be seen. I don't want to trample him with boots and instruments." The young man nodded with unexpected understanding. "We won't take your answer as no, just not yet." That night, Truman sat by the fire in the inn's common room. A few locals were playing cards at a nearby table. A fiddler tuned his strings in the corner. Laughter drifted in through the walls from the saloon next door. He felt apart from it all, but not unwelcome. It was a feeling he had grown used to, the comfort of standing on the edge. He wrote again. "Some part of me still listens for wolves, still marks trees with broken twigs, still checks the sky for smoke. It's not paranoia, it's memory, and memory is the trail I follow now." The following morning, he packed a small satchel, just a few items, not to leave town but to walk out again, to find a nearby hill and spend a day with no voices, no questions, no stories, just the wind and the trees. Will met him on the path just beyond the livery. "Off to disappear again?" he asked with a smile. "Only for a while," Truman said. "I'm not done remembering." He hiked slowly. His body still reminded him of old wounds, but he welcomed them. They were anchors. By midday, he reached a ridge that overlooked the river and the spreading grasslands. He sat on the ground, drew his knees up, and looked out over the horizon. It wasn't Yellowstone, but it was quiet. And in that quiet, he found a strange peace. He no longer needed the forest to remind him who he had become. He carried that wildness inside him now, etched into his memory, written across every scar, sewn into every word of his journal. The wild had not broken him. It had made him visible. Evenings in Helena had become more bearable. The pain in Truman Everts' joints was less severe, and his walks grew longer. The ink stains on his fingers darkened with each passing day, proof that the journal, his old companion, remained ever in use. But lately the entries were changing, less about the past and more about the questions that had grown since his return. Questions like, what does one do after not dying? What happens when your survival becomes a story others tell, but you're still living it? He had begun hosting small gatherings at the inn, quiet evenings where a few curious townsfolk and fellow travelers came not to celebrate him, but to ask him what it had truly felt like to be alone in the wild. They came not for drama or heroics, but for meaning. One evening, they gathered in the back room of the inn where the fireplace cast amber light across the walls and the air smelled of wood smoke and pipe tobacco. Will was there, of course, seated near the hearth. So was Hartley, back from a trip south. A teacher from the local school brought her teenage son, and an older miner sat in silence, nursing a chipped mug. The questions began softly. "What did you miss most?" asked the teacher. Truman didn't hesitate. "Being seen, not just found, but noticed. Out there, I feared that even if I died spectacularly, the forest wouldn't care, it wouldn't remember." "Did you talk to yourself?" asked the boy. "All the time," Truman replied with a faint smile. "At first, to make sense of things, then to remember my voice, and eventually, because it was the only voice I had." "Were you afraid to die?" asked Hartley. Truman grew quiet, then nodded. "At first, yes. Later, not so much. What scared me more was the idea of disappearing without meaning, of being reduced to a footnote." Will leaned forward. "And do you think you weren't?" Truman met his gaze. "I think I was, until I decided not to be." Silence followed. Then the miner finally spoke. His voice was gravel and whiskey. "You ever think you should have died out there?" Everyone turned. Truman didn't flinch. "Yes," he said simply. "There were moments when I thought it would have been cleaner, quieter, simpler. But every time I felt that, something would pull me forward. Hunger, memory, a trick of light. Something always stopped me." The miner nodded slowly. "Then maybe that's the story, not that you survived, but that you didn't stop." Truman turned that thought over in his mind long after the others had gone to bed. He sat alone by the dying fire, his journal open in his lap. He wrote, "They call it survival, but it wasn't a single act. It was 1,000 tiny decisions to keep going when going no longer felt worth it. 1,000 reminders that life, no matter how small or painful, is still life." The next morning, a letter arrived bearing an official seal, an invitation to speak before the Montana Territorial Legislature. A formal setting, a crowd of officials, a stage. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked. The hills west of town were blanketed in a fresh dusting of snow. He took his cane, his coat, and a small tin of biscuits. As he walked, the sounds of Helena faded behind him until it was just wind, his breath, and the crunch of boots against the earth. By midday, he reached a clearing overlooking the valley. The clouds hung low and soft. He sat beneath a pine, pulled out the letter, and read it again. They wanted to hear how he had done it, but Truman was beginning to understand something vital. The real question was why. Why did he continue when all logic said to lie down and let go? Why did he walk when no one was calling his name? He opened his journal and began to write, "We survive, not because we expect to. We survive because the heart makes a promise the body doesn't always understand. Because something within us says, not yet. Not like this." When he returned to town that evening, he sent a reply. Yes, he would speak, but not to give answers, to ask questions, the same ones he was still asking himself. And maybe that would be enough. The room was too clean, too polished. It smelled of waxed wood, pipe smoke, and pressed wool, the scent of formality. Truman Everts stood near the back of the assembly hall, his hands folded around the handle of his cane, his papers pressed to his chest. The Montana Territorial Legislature chamber was abuzz. Delegates in frock coats shuffled papers, murmuring to one another in low tones, some casting glances at Truman as he waited in the wings. From his vantage point, he could see the podium and the rows of seated officials who had gathered to hear from the man who had, against all odds, survived 37 days in the wild. He didn't feel nervous, not exactly, but there was a weight on him, not unlike the burden he had felt carrying his soaked coat through the forest. Back then, it was a matter of staying warm and dry. Now, it was the burden of truth. Will, seated a few rows back, gave him a nod, a silent encouragement. Hartley was also in the room, standing along the side wall, arms crossed, gaze steady. At precisely 2 o'clock, the room was called to order. Truman was introduced with a string of titles: explorer, survivor, chronicler of the Yellowstone expedition. He heard none of them. When the speaker finally gestured to the podium, he moved forward slowly, deliberately. The hall quieted. He placed his papers on the stand but did not read from them. Instead, he looked out over the assembled men. "I know why I was invited here," he began, his voice low but clear. "You want to hear about Yellowstone, about its geysers and its ravines, about the freezing nights and the boiling springs, about how a man can lose everything and still live." He paused, letting the quiet settle. "But I'm not here to tell you how I survived. I'm here to tell you what survival means." He took a breath. "In the forest, I learned that a man isn't made by what he owns or what he commands. A man is made by what he remembers, even when no one is listening. He is made by the promises he keeps to himself when there is no reward. And above all, he is made by how he chooses to go on, step by step, breath by breath, even when he's not sure why." He lifted one hand from the podium. "I walked through Yellowstone not as a trailblazer, but as a ghost. For days, I thought I would die and be swallowed by silence, but the wild did something I didn't expect. It stripped me down, not just of tools and comfort, but of pride, certainty, and even fear. And once all that was gone, I found something else, a will, so quiet it was almost invisible, but it kept me moving." He opened his journal and read a single passage. "The wind does not care if you walk or fall, but it will walk with you if you keep going." He closed the journal. "I don't want my story to be a monument. I want it to be a path. I want you to remember that what saved me was not strength or wisdom. It was remembering names. It was looking for light when there wasn't any. It was lighting a fire, even when I wasn't sure it would be seen." The silence in the room was total. Truman stepped back from the podium. He didn't wait for applause, but it came anyway, low at first, then louder, echoing off the high ceiling. Some delegates stood. Others sat stunned. For a moment, the chamber was no longer a political place, but a human one. Afterward, many approached him. A senator from the Northern District offered to sponsor a printed edition of his account. A reporter asked if he would consider touring the territories to speak. Truman listened politely, but his heart was not stirred. That night he sat with Will and Hartley in the quiet of a stable loft, far from the noise of the gathering. "You told them the truth," Will said. Truman nodded, "but only part of it." "What part did you leave out?" Hartley asked. Truman looked up at the rafters. "That I still dream I'm in the woods. That part of me misses it. Not the cold, not the pain, but the purpose. Out there, everything mattered. In here, sometimes it feels like I'm just a man with a story. Will passed him a tin cup of tea. You're more than that. You're a man who gave us a mirror. Truman smiled faintly. I just hope people look into it. He leaned back, journal open on his lap, and with the faint sounds of horses below and wind at the shutters, he began to write again. Tonight I remembered that silence is not the absence of meaning. It is the space in which meaning waits to be found. It was early spring when Truman Everts decided to return. The snow had begun to loosen its grip on the land, melting into the soil like forgotten thoughts. Birds had returned to the trees, and somewhere, unseen, the rivers pulsed stronger, fed by thawing peaks. He packed light, less than he had the day he first wandered away from the survey party. This time, he carried no illusions of control, only respect. Will accompanied him part way, guiding him along familiar trails outside Helena, but as the terrain became rougher and the trees thicker, Truman insisted on continuing alone. Will, hesitant, eventually relented. "Why go back?" he asked, offering Truman the reins one last time. "To remember it right," Truman said, "not with fear, but with gratitude." He moved at a measured pace. The forest was not the same place he had nearly died in, and he was not the same man who had crawled through it. The branches did not loom. They welcomed. The silence did not threaten. It soothed. His body still bore reminders of the ordeal, a slight limp, joints that cracked when cold, the subtle pull in his chest when he exerted too long. But these were not burdens, they were coordinates, markers of where he had been. By the third day he reached it, the butte that had been his beacon, the place where he had built his last hope from stone, smoke, and sunlight. The fire pit still sat in a loose circle of blackened stones. The surrounding trees, slightly taller now, had begun to reclaim the clearing. Truman sat beside the stones and set down his journal. He didn't write right away. He listened first. To the wind threading through the branches, to the distant crack of a twig, to the steady rhythm of his own breath. "I thought I'd be overwhelmed," he whispered to the empty space, "but I'm not." He removed a folded letter from his coat, one he had written the week before. It was addressed not to anyone, but to the forest itself. He read it aloud. "You did not kill me. You taught me. You did not shelter me, but you showed me shelter. You did not feed me, but you taught me hunger. You were not kind, and yet you gave me every chance to learn kindness. I feared you, I cursed you, but today I thank you." He folded the letter and placed it beneath one of the fire pit stones. Then he opened his journal and began to write. "The butte is still here, as quiet as before, but no longer a place of desperation. Today it is sacred, not because it saved me, but because it witnessed me. Here, I made a promise to myself. Here, I remembered who I was." He stayed until the sun dropped low and gold spilled across the clearing. Then he stood, stretched his legs, and looked one final time at the fire ring. No fire burned now, no smoke curled. But he felt seen, the way the forest sees everything, without judgment, without sentiment, but completely. On the return journey he paused often, not because of exhaustion, but because he no longer felt the need to hurry. He noticed every sapling, every bend in the trail. He greeted birds as if they were old neighbors. He drank from the stream that had once saved his life. He was no longer escaping the forest. He was walking with it. When he reached the edge of Helena days later, he was met by Will, who stood waiting near the same grove where they had parted. "Well?" Will asked. Truman smiled. "I didn't go back to find anything new. I went to say thank you." Will nodded, then handed him a folded newspaper. Truman read the headline. "Survival Story to Become National Publication. Everts' account to be distributed across territories." He folded the paper without comment. "I hope they read more than the headlines," Truman said. "They will," Will replied, "because they'll see that it wasn't about survival. It was about becoming." That night, Truman sat by a familiar fire, journal in hand. He wrote, "Some places never leave you. Not because of what happened there, but because of what you left behind. On that butte, I left my fear, my doubt, my old name. And I walked back into the world carrying something new. The wild. Not on my skin, but in my soul. The day the first bound copies of Truman Everts' Yellowstone account arrived in Helena, the wind carried the scent of melting snow and pine resin through the streets. Spring had fully taken hold of the land, and so too had Truman's story taken hold of the people. They came in twos and threes to the general store, where the books were stacked near the register. Bound in leather with simple gold lettering, the volume bore no dramatic title, just his name, the expedition date, and the quiet assertion, "A record of 37 days." Truman waited until the afternoon to see it himself. He walked with care, not from pain, but from a sense of reverence, as if approaching a grave or a birthplace. When he reached the stack, he picked up a copy and let it rest in his hands for a long time. He ran his fingers across the edge of the cover. It was heavier than he'd imagined. "Feels like you're holding more than pages," Will said, appearing beside him. "I am," Truman replied. "I'm holding every moment I didn't think I'd see again." He paid for the book, though the storekeeper tried to wave him off. Then he left, not back to his room, but toward the schoolhouse. He had been invited by the schoolteacher, Mrs. Calloway, to speak to her students. She said they had read excerpts from his journal and had questions, lots of them. He entered the classroom to find 20 pairs of curious eyes waiting. The children sat in neat rows, their desks worn smooth from generations of scribbling. Mrs. Calloway welcomed him with a warm nod. "Class, this is Mr. Everts." A girl raised her hand before he even sat down. "Did you fight any wolves?" Truman smiled. "Number 1 let them pass. The wild doesn't need a fight to prove itself." A boy asked, "Were you scared every day?" "Yes," Truman answered, "but fear isn't failure, it's just the price of moving forward." Another girl, quieter than the others, raised her hand. "Did you think about us?" Truman tilted his head. "I didn't know you yet." "But children," she said. "Any children." He nodded. "Yes, when it was hardest, I imagined a voice like yours saying, 'Keep going.' And so I did." The room was silent, and then full of hands again. He stayed for over an hour, answering each question with as much care as if it were a matter of survival itself, because, in a way, it was. When he left the classroom, the students lined up at the windows, waving. He walked back through town holding the book under one arm and a bouquet of scribbled thank-you notes in the other. That evening, Truman sat in the garden behind the inn, the book resting on his lap. The fireflies had returned, blinking over the flower beds like silent sentinels. He opened the book, not to the beginning, but to the middle. To the day he almost didn't write, he reread his own words. "Today I heard my own voice and didn't recognize it. I think that means I am changing." He smiled. That voice was his now. Hartley joined him just before the lanterns were lit. "You've made your mark," he said. Truman shook his head. "Number 1 left a trail. If people choose to follow it, they'll find their own mark." Hartley poured them each a cup of coffee from a battered tin. "You ever think of writing more?" Truman tapped the cover of the book. "There's more than survival to write about. I've started something new. Not about Yellowstone. About what comes after." "Life?" Hartley asked. "Possibility," Truman replied. They sat in silence, the kind that came not from the absence of conversation, but from the comfort of it. When the stars emerged, Truman opened his journal again. "I lived. I endured. But most of all, I returned. Not just to a town, not just to a name, but to myself. And from this place, I begin again." The sun was still low in the sky when Truman Everts stepped onto the wooden platform at the edge of the rail station. The iron rails stretched into the distance like long, unwavering thoughts, cold, purposeful, and endless. A light spring wind stirred his coat and tousled the pages of the letter he held in his hand. It was from Washington, an invitation, once again. This time, not just to speak, but to serve. A role with the Department of the Interior. An offer to advise on preservation, exploration, and the stewardship of Yellowstone and other western lands. He had been called a survivor, a symbol, even a sage. Now they asked him to become a guide, not through terrain, but through policy. Will and Hartley had arrived to see him off. The train hadn't yet come, so they stood together in a quiet cluster beside the luggage cart. "You going to say yes?" Will asked. Truman looked down at the letter. "I already did." Hartley clapped him on the shoulder. "You've already walked through fire and frost. A room full of politicians should be a stroll in the garden." "I'm not going for them," Truman said. "I'm going for the trees, the rivers, the voices that can't speak unless someone listens." A bell clanged in the distance, the train's approach. He turned to face his friends. "Everything I've written, everything I've said, it can't matter if it just stays on paper. It has to move. Like the wind, like water. It has to mean something for someone else." They nodded. There was no sadness in the farewell, only recognition. His journey had never truly ended. It had simply shifted terrain. As the train hissed to a halt and passengers began to disembark, Truman moved toward the nearest carriage. But before boarding, he opened his journal one final time on Montana soil. He wrote, 37 days taught me the language of loss, of endurance, of change. But it's the days after that taught me purpose. And purpose, once found, must be carried farther than the place it was discovered." He closed the book and tucked it safely into his coat. The train pulled away, slowly, Helena shrinking behind him like a dream fading into daylight. He watched the landscape change outside the window, pasture into scrub, hill into flat, snowcap into mist. He thought of the school children, of the questions they asked, of the classroom window where a girl had asked, "Did you think of us?" He thought of the butte, the fire pit, the smoke. He thought of the moment the light had reflected off the mirror and told him, "You are not alone." In Washington, there would be rooms without trees, windows without wilderness, but there would also be ears, people who, if he spoke clearly enough, might hear the heartbeat of the land itself. He didn't imagine fame. He didn't imagine power. He imagined protection of a land too wild to speak and too sacred to lose. As the train rattled forward, he opened a blank page. The ink took its place. This is not the end of the story, only the widening of its path. And somewhere ahead, across the great horizon, the wind waited, ready to carry his words further still. Years passed, and the world turned faster. Yellowstone was declared the first national park of its kind, a preserve of wilderness unlike anything the United States or the world had known. Its geysers and cliffs, its rivers and herds were now under the protection of law. But laws alone cannot protect what people do not love. And so, among dusty shelves and soft candlelight, Truman Everts kept writing. His office in Washington was small, tucked into the side of a government building surrounded by louder men and louder missions. He preferred it that way. It reminded him of his cave, cramped, cold, but filled with meaning. Every day he sat at his desk and opened his journal. Not the one that had walked through Yellowstone, but a new volume, clean, waiting. This journal was not for survival. It was for remembering. He wrote letters to senators and secretaries. He drafted maps, not of territories, but of intentions. Trails to follow through the bureaucratic thickets. Pathways of purpose, charted in ink and tenacity. Sometimes, when the noise of the city grew too loud, Truman would rise early and walk to the edge of the Potomac. There, in the hush of morning fog, he could almost hear the wind in the pines, almost smell the sulfur from the geysers. The city receded then. He was back among the wild. He did not return to Yellowstone, not because he feared it, but because he carried it with him. The fire still burned in the hollow of his ribs. The cold still whispered behind his ears, and when he closed his eyes, he could still see the butte. One day, a young clerk brought Truman a letter from a boy in Kansas who had read his account. "Dear Mr. Everts," it began, "I am 10 years old. I have never seen a mountain, but when I read your story, I felt like I was with you. I was scared for you. But then I felt brave. Thank you for making me want to go outside." Truman folded the letter carefully and placed it in a wooden box beside his desk. Then he picked up his pen. He began to write again, not to officials or explorers, but to children. To you, who have not yet seen the wild, it is not a place to conquer, but a place to remember who you are. He wrote until the candle guttered low. He remembered the days when food came only from luck and fire was a coin too rare to spend. He remembered the taste of boiled thistle, the ache of an empty stomach, and the sound of his own voice breaking in solitude. He remembered when survival was not a tale, but a decision. In Washington, he was often called to speak, at museums, in halls, at universities, but when he spoke, it was not the danger that he described. It was the silence. "People imagine I was alone," he once said to a group of young cadets, "but I was surrounded by the breath of trees, by the hunger of snow, by the voice inside me that refused to go quiet." They listened, and in their eyes he saw something rare, a stillness, a leaning forward as if they too were waiting beside a dying fire for dawn to come. He never grew rich. He never wanted to. His earnings went to print more copies of his journal, to fund young surveyors, to send books to small schools where boys and girls might read of a world untouched by fences or clocks. His room remained modest, a cot, a desk, a shelf filled not with trophies but with stones, each one from a place he had loved, one from the butte, one from the riverbank, one from the place where he first saw the mirror flash. He kept a fire going even in the warmer months, not because he was cold, but because the flame reminded him of what had saved him. In the margins of history, he was a footnote, a man who survived. But in the margins of the land, in the trails carved through memory and myth, Truman Everts was a beginning. And the ink, page by page, still whispered like wind through pine. Truman Everts aged slowly, as if time itself walked more gently around those who had already once survived it. His hands, once calloused from cutting branches and clawing through bark, grew thin and spotted. But he still wrote, every day. His handwriting grew less steady, but the words never faltered. Every line in his notebook was marked with conviction, each thought pressed into the page like a footprint in snow. He received more letters, not just from school children anymore, but from explorers, politicians, cartographers, even soldiers. They asked him how to lead in uncertainty, how to endure loss, how to remember the land without possessing it. He answered each with care. Lead like a path through mist, clearly but without arrogance. Loss is not the end of meaning, it is its beginning. You do not own the land, you are loaned its wonder. Sometimes he sat for interviews. Newspapers printed his words, though they often softened them. Editors preferred a tale of triumph. Truman spoke instead of humility. He became a quiet symbol in the Capitol, a living reminder that the American wilderness was more than conquest. It was sacred. One winter evening, a young journalist visited him by candlelight. Truman offered him tea and space near the fire. "Mr. Everts," the young man asked, "what's the most important thing you learned alone in Yellowstone?" Truman took a long breath. Then he answered, "That my life was never my own. It belonged to every hand that reached toward it in the dark." The reporter wrote that down carefully, then asked, "And what now?" Truman looked at the fire. "Now I tend the flame." That winter was long, and Truman grew weaker. He no longer walked to the river. He no longer stood during his speeches, but his voice, low, weathered, unwavering, still filled every room he entered. One night, the fire went out. He was found the next morning seated in his chair, journal open, pen still in hand. The final entry read, "The wind still carries the scent of pine. I am not lost. I am part of the trail." Washington paused. Flags lowered, letters poured in. But the land did not mourn. It simply continued. As Truman would have wanted, somewhere in Yellowstone a hawk circled. A geyser whispered steam into the sky. A butte still held the memory of fire, and a trail, faint but real, waited to be followed. In the years that followed Truman Everts' death, his name slowly faded from headlines but never from the soil. It began with small gestures. A stone marker was placed at the Yellowstone Butte, where he had once lit his fire. Not grand, not gold, just stone. Carved into it were the words, "He walked until walking became memory." Visitors passed it on hikes, often not stopping, but some did. And when they did, they'd find tucked beneath the stone a small pile of tokens, pennies, feathers, handwritten notes folded tight. It wasn't an official tradition, it was something older, human. His journals were republished 3 times in the following decade. Each time they reached further, translated into new languages, added to school curriculums, read beside fires in cabins and classrooms alike. No longer a tale of just one man, the story became a parable about persistence, about stillness, about silence. In a small Montana town, the schoolteacher Mrs. Calloway, now much older, began planting pines behind her school. Not for shade, she said, but for presence. She told her students, "When these trees are tall enough to whisper, listen carefully. You might hear someone walking still." Decades later, those trees towered, and the children, now teachers and parents themselves, kept the story alive. Meanwhile, in Washington, a quiet movement grew. Young conservationists adopted Everts' writings as guiding text. They quoted him not for inspiration alone, but for instruction. In the margins of his journals, they found maps, not geographic, but moral, maps that pointed toward humility, empathy, endurance. One such conservationist was a woman named Rebecca Ellis. She had first read Everts at 14, sitting beneath a tree during a school camping trip. Years later, she would help found the Wilderness Literacy Project. Their mission: to put a nature memoir in the hands of every schoolchild in the Western Territories. Their first mass printing? Everts. Rebecca visited Yellowstone once every year. She never missed. She'd hike to the butte and sit near the stone marker with a journal of her own. She never spoke aloud, but she always wrote. In her final published interview just before her retirement, a journalist asked her why Everts remained so important. She replied, "Because he made the forest feel like a mirror, not something to escape into, but something to see yourself in. And because survival isn't just about making it out alive. It's about what you leave behind. Words, memories, seeds." The butte became a sacred site, not through decree, but through devotion. Hikers lit no fires there. They sat in silence, sometimes with books, sometimes with nothing but the wind. No monument stood taller than the trees. And in those trees, generations later, a child once again asked their parent, "Who was Truman Everts?" And the answer came, as it always had, not from a plaque or a statue, but from a story, from the sound of pages turning beside pine needles, from the hush that falls before a tale is told, from the voice that whispers, "I walked once, and I am still walking." Winter came hard to Yellowstone 50 years after Truman Everts' final breath. A storm, wilder than any in recent memory, swept across the plains and into the park, breaking branches, blanketing buttes, and sealing off trails with a curtain of white. A park ranger named Elias Thorne braved the storm to reach a backcountry cabin that had lost radio contact. Riding a snowmobile through drifts taller than fences, he passed the butte, now half buried in snow. He slowed, tipping his hat to the familiar outline of the marker beneath layers of ice. He knew the story. Every ranger did. By the time he reached the cabin and checked in the 2 volunteers stranded there, the sun had vanished. They huddled near a stove, grateful, shivering. "Thought you might not make it," one said. Elias chuckled. "Truman Everts walked 37 days through worse. I only had to ride 4 hours." They laughed, but then fell quiet, because the name meant something. Later that night, as the fire crackled and the wind howled, Elias pulled a book from his pack, dog-eared, wrapped in oilskin. He passed it to the younger of the 2 volunteers, a college student named Jonah. "Ever read this?" Elias asked. Jonah shook his head. "No." "Start with chapter 3. That's when the pain begins." Jonah read aloud by lantern light while the storm raged outside. Everts's words filled the tiny cabin. "I began to suspect that the wilderness did not intend to kill me, but rather to remake me." The fire hissed. The wind pressed against the walls. That night, long after Jonah fell asleep, Elias stayed awake, watching the snow fall and thinking about how stories survive blizzards. Elsewhere, the Everts collection was growing. At the Library of the Interior, a dedicated room had been opened, maps, letters, original drafts. The display changed each season, but the centerpiece remained, Truman's final journal. People came from across the country to read the handwritten words, "I am not lost, I am part of the trail." Historians debated his influence. Teachers assigned his work. Hikers quoted him on trailheads, tattooed his lines on skin, wrote them in the dirt at campsites. He had become myth, and yet more than myth. He had become a marker. One of the more controversial decisions was to name a remote basin after him, Everts Hollow. Some said it was too quiet a place, too modest, but others said it was perfect. A basin is where rivers begin, where life collects, where echoes linger. Every year during the spring thaw, rangers cleared the trail to the butte and the hollow. They left the stone untouched but maintained the paths, and in one hidden spot nearby, a second stone lay flat to the ground. On it, fewer words. "Let the wind find you. Let the silence keep you." No one admitted who carved it. A girl once found it by accident and asked her father what it meant. He said, "It means you're not the first to feel small out here, and you won't be the last." Yellowstone still roared with its geysers, still steamed and howled and shimmered, but to those who'd heard his story, it also whispered. A whisper that reached across ice and ash and storm. Truman Everts never drew a map of his 37-day journey, not one of trails or peaks or coordinates. What he left behind instead were fragments, breadcrumbs of thought scattered across journals, letters, and lectures. Yet years later, a man named Dr. Simon Bell, a historian and cartographer, undertook the task. He had grown obsessed with Truman's path, not just where he had walked, but why. He pored over each account, tracked supply records from the original expedition, and read the terrain as Truman might have. Not as a surveyor, but as a soul searching for a way forward. Dr. Bell's map was unlike any other. It blended geography with quotations, elevation with emotion. Instead of a legend, it had a preface. Instead of a border, it had a closing line. This is not a path to follow. It is a path to remember. When the map was unveiled in a Yellowstone visitor center, people gathered not to study landmarks, but to stand quietly tracing the line that zigzagged between near death and determination. Small placards marked key moments. Here, he fell into boiling springs. Here, he saw the bear and did not run. Here, he slept beside his last fire. Tourists left notes by the map. "I lost my father this year. Your story reminded me to keep walking. I've never been alone in the woods, but now I think I should try. I thought survival was about strength. I didn't know it was about memory." Children pressed their hands to the glass. Elders read every word. And somewhere deep in the corner of the room, a ranger wept without embarrassment. Dr. Bell later published a book titled The Map Within, charting the soul of Truman Everts. It didn't sell widely, but it changed lives. Readers wrote him long letters, some sharing their own stories of survival, others asking only one question. Do you think he knew? Did Truman Everts know that his suffering, his footsteps, would ripple outward for generations? Dr. Bell never answered directly, but in the final pages of his book he offered this. To survive is to make a mark you may never see, to walk through fire, not for applause, but so that someone else may know the way is possible. The map now hangs in the National Museum of American Resilience, an exhibit not about war or politics, but about what human beings carry when there's nothing left to hold. And at its center, surrounded by letters, ashes, and stones, is a single sentence. I am not lost. I am part of the trail. Generations passed. The pages of Truman Everts' journals grew brittle with age, but their words grew louder in meaning. In distant cabins, digital archives, and old leather-bound libraries, the story lived on, carried not by fame, but by faith. At a wilderness leadership camp run near the edge of Yellowstone's southern boundary, a program was named the Everts Retreat. Once a year, 12 students, some from cities, some from small towns, were invited to spend 2 weeks in the backcountry. No phones, no modern conveniences, just gear, journals, firewood, and one rule. Every night, they read aloud from Truman's account. On the 5th day of one such retreat, a girl named Ava stumbled on a slope and broke her wrist. She had been confident, a natural leader. The fall shook her, not just her body, but her voice. That night, she sat by the fire, silent, her arm in a makeshift sling. Her fellow campers hesitated until one of them, a boy named Jordan, picked up the dog-eared copy of Truman's journal and handed it to her. "You read tonight," he said. Ava blinked. "But, please." She read slowly, her voice uneven, but by the end of the entry her tone had deepened. When she closed the journal, the circle was quiet. "Why did he keep going?" Ava asked. An older student, Lexi, answered. "Because the forest doesn't stop even when we do." Another chimed in. "Because something in him was louder than the cold." Ava stared into the fire. "I think maybe he kept going so we could learn how." That night, a new tradition began. Each camper carved a single word onto a wooden token at the end of their stay. That word was their gift back to the wild. The tokens were placed in a hidden grove near the Everts Trail, nestled into a hollow beside a tree marked with a simple brass tag. Fire circle. Some tokens read brave, others begin, still, home. Over time, the hollow filled. The tradition was never advertised, never institutionalized. But year after year, young people came, carved, remembered. Years later, Ava returned to the camp as a leader. Her own daughter Lila joined the retreat at 12. On the final night, it rained. The fire hissed and guttered, but they sat close, the journal protected beneath a tarp. Ava read aloud from the same entry she had once struggled to speak. "I feared death, not because it meant an end, but because it meant I wouldn't get to try again." She closed the book and looked at her daughter. "What does that mean to you?" Lila answered. "It means surviving is just the start." The other campers nodded. The rain softened. And though no one said it, everyone felt it. Truman's fire had not gone out. It had only passed into different hands. Back in Washington, in a quiet archival room, a curator cataloged another donation. Letters from past Everts retreat participants. Each bore stories of change. Some had become rangers, some poets. Some simply said they now listened to trees differently. The curator, a soft-spoken woman with streaks of gray in her hair, placed the letters beside Everts' own. She whispered, "Still walking, Truman. Still walking." At the dawn of a new century, the boundaries of Yellowstone had shifted, and so had the world around it. Roads now wound through the forest where once there were only game trails. Drones sometimes hummed overhead where only ravens used to soar. Signs pointed to places once known only to those who had nearly died to find them. And yet, in one stretch of remote terrain, beyond the paved loops, beyond the guided tours, there remained a silence so full it felt like memory. It was here that a group of conservationists, historians, and indigenous elders gathered to mark 200 years since the birth of Truman Everts. They did not unveil a monument. They did not cut a ribbon. Instead, they formed a circle around the stone at the butte, the one that simply read, "He walked until walking became memory." An elder from the Crow Nation, a woman named Ada Strong Elk, stepped forward first. "We remember not just the man," she said, "but the humility with which he returned. He did not try to own what he saw. He tried to understand it. That's why the land let him leave." Next, a young girl from the local tribal school read from Everts' journal, her voice high and soft. "I ate thistle and slept under fear. But I woke up still here. That was enough." Then silence. Not because they had nothing to say, but because the land had everything to say. Over the following days they walked, not in pilgrimage, but in practice. Each step was a conversation with the ground. Some spoke aloud, others wrote quietly. And all of them, without prompting, left behind something small on the trail, a carved word, a feather, a folded piece of paper. One man left a compass, another a pair of worn-out boots. A woman placed a simple sign along the path. Here, someone chose not to give up. In a small cabin maintained by the Park Service, a digital archive was activated, a holographic narration of Truman's account told in his own voice, restored and reconstructed from letters and early recordings. Children sat in the dark, listening. "I wasn't brave," the voice said, "but I was stubborn enough to stay alive." The screen faded to black. In that cabin, a guest book lay open. Thousands had signed it. On the final page, Someone had drawn only a line, a crooked trail leading to a single word. Still. That winter, snow covered the butte again. The fire ring was buried, the tokens hidden beneath a thick white hush. And in Washington, an archivist placed the last known letter of Truman Everts into a protective sleeve. It had been written to a woman named Margaret, no last name, no recorded relationship. It read simply, "I do not know what this story will mean to others, but I hope that when they walk through fear, they remember that light can come from the smallest spark, even from a thistle fire." It was signed, T. Everts. That letter now sits beside his final journal, encased in glass beneath soft lighting. Visitors pause before it, rarely speaking. Some write their own words in the replica journal left on a nearby table. Some leave pressed flowers. Others sit for long moments in silence, as if waiting for something they can't quite name. But one thing remains true, spoken not by any narrator or guide, but by the land itself. The trail is still there, and those who need it, will find it.